Welcome to, this is our first webinar for London Region IWA in 2022, and I'm really pleased that we are having the subject we are tonight, when we've had lifeboats on the River Thames for 20 years now, as from the beginning of this month. You'll see behind me, in fact, if I move slightly, you'll see my little boat with Gravesend Lifeboat next to it. And that's when a group of us took our narrowboats down to the Thames to Gravesend and were overnight on the town pier, which I can tell you in a narrowboat is quite something with the activity on the river. I'm delighted to welcome Wayne. Wayne Bellamy is our station manager at Chiswick and has been ever since the inception of lifeboats on Thames. I think you're the only one, actually, Wayne, that's still the same person as was there from the start on station. So I've known Wayne all that time, and it's a great joy that he's going to speak to us this evening. So I'm now going to pass over to Wayne to talk to us about the lifeboats on the Thames. And welcome, Wayne. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Libby, and good evening, everyone. So let me start, or I'm going to switch over and do a share screen so I can show you some photographs and pictures and tell some stories about all sorts of things that have been going on here over the last 20 years. And then just to reiterate what Libby has just shared, we are celebrating all of our lifeboat stations in London, what we call the Thames Lifeboats. That would be the one at Teddington, this one here at Chiswick, a little bit further downriver at Tower underneath Waterloo Bridge, and then the station in Libby's photograph down at Gravesend. We are celebrating our 20th birthday, which is good, which is really good. So we've got a lot of things planned this year to help us celebrate it. And while I should have, if this has all worked really well, you should now all be able to see the screen that I'm sharing. So if I can just advance this over. So Libby, just before I start talking aimlessly to myself, could you just let me know that that slide has come up properly and that the IT bit is all working okay?
Yes, it's absolutely fine. Can you hear me?
Good. Yeah, I can. Yeah, thanks, Libby. I just wanted to make sure that was all working. Like I said, so that I didn't miss anybody out. All right, so good. Okay, well, welcome. And like I said, I'm just going to start a little bit about our lifeboats on the Thames. And Libby said I'm one of the originals. I've been around since before it started up. I was there was three of us who created this and did a little bit of the work beforehand, before all the boats went operational in January of 2002. Ian, who was at Gravesend, and Janet, who was at Tower, they've since retired. And I'm the last one of those original three. However, a number of the people who joined our crew in those early days are still around, including Kevin, who's now the manager at Tower, and then Jason, who's the manager at Gravesend. So there's a lot of experience in the room. And as I was saying, our 20th birthday, we've also got a lot of, within the RNLI, your 20-year medal is a bit of a big deal. And I think we've got about 15 people across the four stations who are due to receive their 20-year medal this year, which is great. Okay, so I'm going to start. This should be a picture of the UK and Ireland. And in the picture, you'll see quite a number of orange dots. And those are a couple of years ago where all the rescues happened. And then you'll see a whole bunch of blue dots. And those were where those people that we rescue, where they lived. And this is always, it's really important when we start to talk about the RNLI, obviously operating around the coast with our rescue service, but also having a significant presence inland. You can easily see from the picture that, the big population centers in and around London, and you can see Birmingham and Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow and Edinburgh and Newcastle and the area around the Tyne and Belfast, all the big groupings of where people live. become quite important. And that's really important for us because everyone knows from an RNLI point of view, we do lots and lots of rescue, but we also do lots and lots of prevention work, trying to stop the accidents from happening in the first place. And we try to do a lot of education work, both with adults, with community interest groups, activity groups like diving or stand-up paddleboarding or kayaking or all those sort of things, as well as school groups. And we have a significant presence all across the UK and particularly in London, where we have education officers, is what we call them, and they go into schools and into these community groups and tell stories very similar to what I'm sharing with you this evening, and using them as examples of where things have gone wrong for others and where we would hope that things wouldn't go wrong for the people that we're speaking to that evening. Okay, so a normal year, an average year around the UK and Ireland, our 238 lifeboat stations would respond to a little over 9,000 incidents in a normal year. And then on top of that, we have another 280 beaches where we provide a lifeguarding service, usually on a seasonal basis in the summer months when the weather is nice and warm. Okay, so the RNLI has a number of different types of lifeboats. We've got big ones, little ones, and we've got everything in between. Some of the boats are designed to work in inshore areas. Going back to my picture where all the orange dots are, you can see that the vast majority of the orange dots are all fairly close to shore. There's a few that are further away, but most of them are fairly close to shore. So we've got a range of lifeboats, of rescue equipment that we use, and it's different in all sorts of places. And it's not different by accident. We go through a risk assessment process, and that process looks at the activity in the area. It looks at the area's population and propensity to have accidents and what sort of things go wrong. And based on that, and based on the risk assessment, we then introduce control measures. And the control measures are lifeboats and lifeboat crew to deal with what happens most often in those particular areas. So some places might wind up with an inshore lifeboat. Some places might wind up with a offshore lifeboat, or a boat that can go out in any weather. We have different sizes of both, some that go down slipways, some that go down beaches, some that are afloat all the time. And then in certain particular areas, there is a unique risk. And when that happens, we have a couple of things that we can solve specific problems with specific solutions. The first one is Hovercraft. So we have 4 stations through the UK that operate Hovercraft, and these are particularly areas where there are large areas of exposed sand and beach at foreshore. And there's, like I said, there's 4 of them in the UK. And the other place where we operate a very specific piece of equipment is in London. And the picture you have in front of you is what in RNLI language is called an E-class lifeboat, which is why the number on the side of it is E- and a number. And we only operate that boat at 2 lifeboat stations. The station here at Chiswick is one of them, and the station downriver at Tower is the other. So we have 4 of them that operate between the 2 stations. These are the Mark II version of that boat. For people that have been around the RNLI's operation, if you've ever seen our operation in London before, we had the Mark I version of the lifeboat, which is number 1 to 6. One of those is in the museum, the Historic Museum, Lifeboat Museum in Chatham. And then we now operate the Mark II version, and the numbers on those are 7, 8, 9, and 10. So that's a picture of one of the boats here at Chiswick. And you'll hear me as we go through this evening, you'll hear me now and again, I'll refer to the fact that we're a charity and that we fundraise for everything. And we have 2 principal ways of fundraising. One is through donations, and the other is through legacies. And this boat, number 8, is the Doggie and Donut Bee. This was a boat funded for us by a legacy. And it was a legacy. Doggie was a merchant seaman who later worked for the Port of London Authority, and in their estate, they gifted us a significant amount of money that principally funded this lifeboat for us. And each of the 4 lifeboats that we operate in London, their replacement cost today would be well over £500,000 each. Operationally, the E-Class lifeboat is fairly different. It sort of sits in between what we would usually have as an inshore boat, but it uses some of the technology that we'd usually have in some of our offshore boats. So it's an open rib, as you see, which is great because it's about visibility and survivor recovery and maneuverability and all these sort of things. It doesn't provide us any protection from the elements, sadly, which this time of year when it's like 2 degrees outside is not very good. But it's powered by water jets and twin diesel engines, which make it not only incredibly fast, it's the fastest lifeboat we have in the entire RNLI's fleet, but it's also one of the most maneuverable, and that's because of the twin water jets that it operates with. That technology, the twin diesel and water jets, has now, bearing in mind we've been operating this technology in London for 20 years, that propulsion system, that technology, is now starting to find its way into some of our lifeboats around the coast. And the one that you may have seen recently, our newest all-weather lifeboat is called the Shannon, which principally is launched off a carriage, although it does launch down slipways and lie afloat, but it uses the same technology, twin diesels with water jets, albeit they're ever so slightly bigger than the one that we operate on the E-Class in London. From an equipment point of view, it's got everything from a communications point of view that we would ever need. We can speak with all of the maritime world as well as all of the emergency services world in London with the police, the fire brigade, ambulance, and so on. And then it carries a significant complement of medical equipment. And that's mainly because our boats in London do a much higher proportion of clinical work, of medical work, than what we would usually expect to see at lifeboat stations around the coast. So coming back to one of my opening things where I said there's 238 lifeboat stations around all of the UK and Ireland, and they do somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 jobs a year. Our stations in London do about 10%, these 4 stations do about 10% of all of those jobs, but we do 25% of all of its clinical work, and we do 50% of all of its resus work. So people who are properly unwell. So these 3 or 4 boats do half of all of that clinical life-saving where people are in a particularly bad way when we rescue them into the boat. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the Thames, particularly the central part of the Thames, has that much higher percentage. And I'll come on to the next slide. So this is a picture off the lifeboat station at Chiswick. And this is low-ish water. For those of you who boat down the tideway, you'll all be aware that it's tidal, and the tidal range here, depending on whether you're on springs or neaps, but the tidal range will be between 5 and 7.5 meters. So this picture is taken at fairly low water. It's still got a ways to go out. This picture was on neaps. It can go a little bit lower. But we've got this unique dynamic that occurs through West and through Central London. And it's a combination of the fluvial water coming downriver, coming down from the Thames, from the non-tidal section, combining with the North Sea and the flood tides that then come upriver and through the Thames barrier. And that dynamic, that interaction between the incoming tide and the outgoing fluvial, it really changes how our tidal cycle works in West London. For starters, a lot of the people in West London don't realize the Thames tidal and that it does go up and down, because to have a tidal river through a major city, certainly a city of 9 million people, is very, very unusual. There's very few cities in the world and very few European major cities where have a tidal river that flow through them. A lot of them might have tidal harbors, but not necessarily a tidal river. And there's a big difference between the two. All right, so the tide goes in and out. And normally, for those of you who are mariners around the coast, you'll know that the tidal cycle is around about 6 hours and 20 minutes for it to come in and around about 6 hours and 20 minutes for it to go out. But that's not what happens here. Here, it'll go from this picture you see at low water to this picture you see at high water in just over 4.5 hours. And that tide has risen at its peak 7.5 meters. So what that means in the real world for us as rescuers is if we have an episode like a person who's trapped on an area of foreshore, an area of beach, the tide is rising about 1 foot every 10 minutes for us. And that strongly influences how we rescue, okay? It influences the boats that we need to operate, hence the water jets that I spoke about a minute ago, which are very shallow draft and maneuverable. It also affects the kit that we carry on the boat, where we can extricate or rescue people from really difficult spots quickly. And it also influences how we work with other emergency services. All right, so the first big factor, and we call them the big three. The first big factor we have in London is the tidal range and the tidal speed. The second big factor is water temperatures. So if you're inland boaters, canal boaters and what have you, you'll be used to the water temperatures broadly resembling the air temperatures. But that's not what happens around the coast of the UK. Most of the water temperatures around the coast of the UK are somewhere between 12.5 and 14.5 degrees C, which is fine. And year-round, winter to summer, because the temperature of those waters is influenced by ocean currents, those water temperatures don't fluctuate wildly. But here in freshwater and west and central London, even though the tide goes in and out, it's all freshwater. Here in central London, the water temperatures fluctuate hugely. In the winter, certainly today, I think we've got a water temperature of around about 5 degrees today. In the summer, late summer, it's not unusual for us to see water temperatures in the low to mid 20 degrees C. And the temperature of the water, as we all know, is a significant factor behind how quickly and how severely people become unwell if they're unintentionally immersed in it. So tide coming in and out and the speed was the first. Second factor being the temperature of the water. And the third factor is we've got 9 million people living within a few miles of all of this water that are happening. And certainly here at Chiswick, about 60% of the jobs that we deal with are people and no boat. Okay, so these are people who had no intention whatsoever of being anywhere near the water, yet for all of the reasons that can happen, they do. Within that 60% is some suicide work. That's a real part of what our crews here do. About 30%, so 60% is people no boat, 30% is people with boat. That can be things like, and you'll see some pictures that are coming up, actually the pictures will give you a good flavor for some of the things that do go on. The other 10% can be a variety of anything. They can be cars, animals. We do a lot of dogs, especially because dogs like to chase birds, and then the dogs get into difficulty, and then the owners try to rescue the dogs. Occasionally, we've had a cat. You will have seen in the news last year we had a whale, and we get everything in between with birds and you name it. In my experience, animals almost always rescue themselves. So if you are a pet owner, not necessarily a whale owner, but a pet owner anyway, if your animal does get into difficulty, the chances are it will rescue itself. So don't put yourself at risk trying to do that. Okay, so let's get into some of the things that happened. Now, I don't know, I'm hoping you guys can see my cursor appearing on the screen so I can point to a few things on this. So obviously the lifeboat's in the foreground, and this is Tower Bridge. So this is This is the type of incident that has begun to increase over the last 6 or 7 years, I suppose. And this was a person who was sat up on the stonework. If you can see my cursor moving up there, they were sat up on the stonework, and they were facing away from the river. So their back was towards the river. And you'll all know that your cameras have your phones have front-facing cameras, and they were trying to position themselves to get this lovely selfie with the Tower of London in the background. Well, of course, it all went horribly wrong, and they fell backwards off this area of the bridge where they'd been sat. They then struck this part of the buttress, the stone buttress down here, and then went splash into the water. Luckily, the people up the top knew to call 999, and the lifeboat was able to come along very quickly. In fact, in this particular case, it was only just slightly upriver when the call came in. But the members of the public knew to ring 999, and the call went to London Coast Guard, who coordinates all of our rescue activity across London on the Thames, and they had the lifeboat come along and do the rescue. Another example of the sort of things that go on. So the first one was person, no boat. This one is a person and boat. And this was just in front of Swan Lane Pier, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a pier built out over the river just downstream from London Bridge, which is what you see in the background. And the boat had caught on fire, and it was at risk of drifting underneath Swan Lane Pier. Now, Swan Lane Pier is built out of wood pilings that are covered in creosote, and some of you will know that that's incredibly, incredibly flammable when it gets hot enough. Our lifeboats themselves don't carry any significant firefighting capability. But what we are good at is we are good at getting to places really quickly. And that's what we did here. We got to the burning boat very quickly and simply just threw a line on it and started to tow it out of or away from Swan Lane Pier, and bought the whole thing some time. And you'll see in the background, just coming through London Bridge, is one of the fireboats with London Fire Brigade, and they're the ones who will come along and put the fire out. And you can see in the picture that their monitor is beginning to start up to be able to discharge the water to do just that. So that quick response, it does what it says on the tin. We aim to get anywhere within 15 minutes on the tidal Thames. In reality, for most of our jobs, we are in fact getting to them within about 8 or 9, which is really good. All right, so broken boats. So this was a aggregate barge that was outbound from Wandsworth heading downstream, and they had a mechanical failure. It was a steering gear failure, and they lost control of the boat. So this crumpled heap that you see right here used to be the wheelhouse. So it used to come off up to about there and go over and come down. And there was 2 people inside the wheelhouse when they collided with the bridge. So we were able to get there. We were eventually able to tow it out up against the tide. But for anyone who's been around London, West London for a while, you'll remember Battersea Bridge being broken, being closed for, it was a good 6 months, I think, in about 2007, 8, thereabouts. And this is what caused it. So the barge hit the bridge with enough force that it caused structural damage to the bridge that wound up having to be closed. All right, rising tide. Now, one of the benefits about being on a lifeboat that can get anywhere really quick, and it can get anywhere, it can get to a lot of places that other people can't. So this was a person who'd fallen off the off the towpath down in Wandsworth. And you'll see from the response that we've got a couple of fire engines up there and all the firefighters, and there's an ambulance there from London Ambulance Service, and there's a couple of police officers there as well. And that's great. There's a really good turnout, but the only people that could get to the person, the casualty, was us. And it's simply because we got access with the boat, and there was no other way for anyone else to be able to get down there. This was an example of the tide was rising, and again, it was rising about a foot every 10 minutes. So from the time that we arrived on scene, this person was fully spinal, severe head and spinal injuries. We had about 20 minutes to be able to treat them and get them out because of the tide coming in. Okay, Dutch barge. This is just coming through Hammersmith Bridge. This is the classic first boating trip of the season syndrome. So this barge had its winter plan maintenance and everything done. First trip of the year, comes away from Dove Pier to go outbound. All the lines come off. It swings broadside on the tide, and the engine conks out. On its own, there wasn't much in its way that it was going to hit or collide with early on. But what was a concern is down around the corner were a large group of junior rowers out in single sculls and pairs. And had the barge, our concern certainly was, had the barge drifted through the large group of children broadside, it carried significant risk to hurt them, is the honest answer. So the boats that we have here, and again, you saw the picture of the E-class lifeboat. It's not particularly big. It's only 10 meters long, but it's got 1,000 horsepower, and it can tow pretty much everything on the river. It might not tow it quick, but it tows it fast enough to make it safe, and then to be able to get it back alongside, back in a place of safety. Hammersmith Bridge again. Hammersmith Bridge got a bit of a reputation, and this is maybe helpful for you guys because I know a lot of you do the Limehouse link trip. So Hammersmith Bridge is the lowest air draft bridge on the river. At mean high water springs, it's only got about 3 meters on springs high water, which you'll see on our lifeboats firstly, because the entire radar arch antenna superstructure bit on our boat can collapse so that we can get underneath this bridge at all states of the tide. But Hammersmith Bridge catches a lot of people out. So this was a mechanical failure on a boat. This was boat race day a few years ago. And this was a passenger boat. This was after the men's boat race had finished. But this charter boat specializes in disabled passengers. And they had 6 wheelchair passengers on board and 6 crew, 6 attendants for the wheelchairs, and then they had a couple of crew on board. And they had mechanical failure, and they wound up on broadside on Hammersmith Bridge. The obvious concern was the tide, and you can see by the anger in the water that the tide is still running in quite strongly. The concern was that the boat was going to capsize. It was going to breach, roll, and capsize as the tide continued to push it upriver and rose into the bridge. On boat race day, and there's a few days of the year. There's actually about 12 days of the year where, I mentioned earlier, everything starts with a risk assessment. And boat race days is one of those days that, because of the huge amount of people that are either near or by or on the water, we increase the resource that we have here at Chiswick. This was an example where we had 2 E-class lifeboats on duty that day, and we had extra people in to be able to crew them. And I'm glad that we did, because we needed everybody to be able to get those 6 wheelchairs and the other people, the attendants and the crew, off of it in time. In the end, the boat didn't roll and capsize, but that was a real close call, that one. We weren't going to sit there and wait and watch to see if it wasn't going to happen, that's for sure. Okay, I don't know if we have anyone on our call this evening who's a rower, but this is a picture of what can go wrong with people when they're rowing. So just a few things to think about or to chat about with this. So this was it was a head race. So it was an organized event where a rowing crew, in fact, many hundred rowing crew, were racing against the clock, and they would go from Chiswick down to Putney. And these girls had done that. They'd finished racing. And after they'd crossed the finishing line, they turned and they started to come back inbound against the tide to return upriver. And as is quite common, most accidents happen when people aren't paying attention or paying their most attention. And certainly when people are racing and competing and they're all focused and concentrating on what they're doing, the tendency is that things don't go wrong then. That's the tendency. Most of the time when things go wrong, it's when you're least expecting it to. And this was an example of that. So they were a returning crew. They were traveling inbound and they'd passed all through Putney. And they had paused and they'd lost their concentration, and they were putting their fleecies and their warmer clothing and what have you back on. And the tide turned the boat and wrapped it broadside around this buoy. The buoy's nicknamed around here, called the Black Buoy, and it's big. And and the boat, the rowing boat that they were in, broke in two. So rowers are taught that should they become, they don't wear life jackets apart from the coxswain, and they're taught that that if you wind up in the water, to stay with your boat, because your boat is your flotation. But it's pretty obvious in the picture, given that the bow of the boat is pointing vertically up over in the background here, and the stern is somewhere floating downriver by this stage, that staying with the boat wasn't too much of an option. Equally, there's 8 girls here who are in the water without a life jacket on, and that's a bit of a concern, because if you are in the water without a life jacket, if for whatever reason you do become unconscious, then you've got nothing to right you face up so that you can keep breathing. And I look at this picture and I look at all of the rowing blades, the oars that are in this vertical position, and I often wonder how close some of those may have come to someone's head as they were falling back down into the water. And then the last thing, so there is one person on the boat who does wear a life jacket, and that's the coxswain. And yet in this picture, the coxswain's life jacket has failed to inflate. And that brings me on to another really interesting point, and it's a valuable lesson for everybody. A number of years ago, I suppose about 7 years ago, a gentleman who was a friend of ours, who was a friend of the rowing communities, is well known on the river in West London. So he drowned, and he was known as someone he was regarded as someone who is particularly conscious about safety and about his PPE and his life jacket and all the stuff that he chose to wear and use. And yet he drowned. And when we recovered his body about 5 weeks later, we found him not wearing a life jacket, and that caused a lot of worry amongst everyone within the rowing community, everyone within the river community in West London. And it spurned a campaign that we helped with as much as we could, and lots of people did, about life jacket safety, and making sure not only having the life jacket, but make sure it gets regularly checked and serviced, and that it works should you need it to. So at the time, this was 2006, we checked, we and others checked about 2,000 life jackets, and across the river community in West London, we found a 75% failure rate across the 2,000 life jackets. We found one school who had a 100% failure rate. So that school was regularly putting children out on the water, and should those life jackets have been needed, none of them would have worked. That was many years ago, and everyone paid attention. And I want to fast forward now to last summer. And this was when we were coming out of, this was the summer of, late summer of 2020, when we're all coming out of COVID lockdown. And many people hadn't been on the water for a significant period of time because of rowing activity, leisure activity wasn't permitted. So others and us, we ran a campaign about returning to boating. And one of the things that we did, one of the many things that we did as part of the campaign, was life jacket checks. And it gave us an opportunity to look at the numbers 5 or 6 years later from when we'd done it before. And we had a 100% pass rate. Okay, and that was really, really lovely to see. That doesn't mean the job's done, because people change, new people join the sport, people leave the sport, and people move around. So checking the life jackets, checking the safety equipment on your boats, making sure all the machinery works, it's a constant cycle that needs to be done. And Libby knows, other knows, that with the RNLI, we can help with all of that. We have a number of programs and a number of people out in the community with water safety officers and water safety advisors who can help run life jack clinics. It's all on our website, and when we get to the Q&A at the end, if people have any questions about how we can help you do any of that, then by all means, please feel free, because it's really, 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 really worth it. Okay, this is just outside of the lifeboat station here at Chiswick, and I put this picture in. So we've got a boatload of rowers inside the lifeboat, and this was a March day, and we were taking waves right over the top of the lifeboat, and that's on the River Thames in West London. So for you guys who are narrow boaters and Dutch barge owners and come onto the tideway, it can get rough here. All of the usual messages that we talk about check the weather, check the tides, what's the wind doing? Are there any other environmental factors that are going to affect your ability to navigate on the tideway? Okay, it's just as applicable here in West London as if you were going across the English Channel, because like I said, most times that you get caught out are when you're least expecting it. Now, not all of the people we rescue are, well, this was boat race in 2012. And we, right in the middle of the event, we got called to a person who was seen in the water. Obviously, later we learned that it was someone up to a bit of mischief. But it's a great lesson and sort of story for us about, you don't quite know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and when you might wind up being on TV all around the world. And you can tell by the expression, Tony is the guy who sat here, you could tell that he was really pleased that he was having to get this guy out of the water, because not only was he putting himself, but many others at a significant amount of risk. So we're lucky here, we get lots of variety, and you never quite know what's going to be happening when you come in for your shift every day. Now, this is a totally different, there's no lifeboat, there's no rescue happening here. This is this is an example. I've talked about prevention and safety and trying to stop accidents from happening in the first place through life jackets and all those sort of things. This is another thing that we can do. So this is an area just upstream, just downstream of Hammersmith Bridge. It's an area of foreshore, like many areas that we see around rivers all across London, where redevelopment occurs. It was old brownfield site, and it was being redeveloped, and into the usual posh flats, bars, restaurants, all those sort of things that we see. And as part of the planning permission for this particular site, they had to raise the river wall to the 1,000-year flood defense level. So you'll see in the photograph, there's this stonework that rises up, and then there's the top 3 feet of concrete, and that's where the river wall was changed. And then the architect who did this thought, I need to put a railing in. I need to edge protect this area to stop people from falling into the water. That's a really great idea. But then they stopped thinking, I think, at this stage, and they thought, let's make it look really funky, and let's angle the railing so that it leans back like this. And I'm hoping that they did that unintentionally, because what it's done, as you'll see with the 3 or 4 people who are sat here, is it's created a perfect sitting area outside of, on the wrong side of, the edge protection. And what's even better is the pub that this is in front of is one of the busiest pubs along the river in West London. So on a nice, hot, warm, sunny day, this will be solid people sat there having a beer or having a few beers, and then getting up and over to go back in and get another beer and come back over. And they're constantly stepping over the mitigation, the railing, the thing that was designed to keep them there in the first place. The last thing that's interesting about this is there's ladders installed all along the river wall, so that should someone fall in, they've got an ability to try to rescue themselves and get themselves out. Sadly, when these people raised the flood defenses 3 feet, they didn't think to raise the ladders 3 feet as well. So the ladders right now finish 3 feet short of the top. Hey-ho. But that just, it's an illustration of another way to look at a problem and how difficult some of this stuff is to get fixed. And it helps people understand why people get into trouble in the first place. Good. All right, that's the end of my pictures and storytelling. So I think Libby now wants to switch to a little bit of Q&A. So Libby, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Good. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to change the room I'm in, because not only am I here, I've never had 75 people in my office before, so this is a great way to put it. But if you saw how big my office was, you can only fit 2 in here, let alone 75. But I'm just going to come out into the other room, because I've got our crew. Oh, we want to go in the room next door, yeah. So we thought, just for something a little bit different, when we're doing the Q&A, we're going to have our entire night shift crew in here with us, and they're going to come in and they're going to sit down so you can all see them. And as the questions come in, if there's stuff that you want to ask them as well as me, or in addition to me, then feel free. So starting on this side, drinking his cup of tea, is Glenn. Coffee. Paul is next, Stephen, and Tim. So Libby, if we want to go to you to start the questions, please.
Okay, thank you. Actually, there aren't very many through yet, so can you start using the Q&A button for that? And perhaps whilst we're waiting for those to come through, it's worth mentioning that in the 3, yes, Chiswick Tower and Gravesend, the crew are on site 24 hours a day, which is unusual. They don't operate on a shout in the same way as coastal stations do and Teddington does. If you think about it, trying to get yourself to through London to the lifeboat station is going to take rather a long time. So they have night shifts and they have day shifts. So far, we've got lots of things saying about thanking you for, right. So let's start with how are lifeboat stations staffed, from Colin.
Well, so Colin, it depends on where you are. So our stations around the coast are principally on pagers, so that if there's an emergency that goes, the 999 call goes to the police or Coast Guard, the crew's pagers are activated. Normally, a crew will assemble in around about 10 minutes and then have their lifeboat afloat and underway as soon as they can after that. There are 4 places where we do things a little bit differently. So all of our pager stations are stations which are managed and crewed entirely by volunteers. Where we have an all-weather lifeboat, we will certainly have 1, and in some cases have 2 members of staff who work in that lifeboat station, principally because of all the planned maintenance and machinery requirement that we have for the kit that's there. but then they also provide some coverage when they go afloat. So that's how 234 of them operate. There's 4 that are a little bit different, and 3 of those 4 are in London. So the first one that's different is Spurn Point, or the Humber, and we have a crew there 24 hours a day. And they're a crew of 6, and a crew of 5, and their crewing regime is they do 6 days on, 6 days off. If you're familiar with Spurn Point, it's quite remote and it's quite a distance from anywhere else. So we've got some RNLI buildings out at the end of the station is out at the end of the point, and they spend 6 days straight there, and then they go home for 6 days. Our crewing regime in London is slightly different than that. So the stations are crewed 24 hours a day. Our launch times are around about 1.5 minutes. And collectively, so using Chiswick as an example, we've got 9 members of staff and about 64 volunteer crew. All of them do 12-hour shifts, and we have a day shift and a night shift. So our minimum crew is 3, our ideal crew is 4. Sometimes it's these 4, but it's these 4 tonight. But there's about 75 people here at Chiswick wind up having at least 3, but usually 4 people in here 24 hours a day.
Thank you. We've been asked what the age limit is for crew on the boats.
Testing the old knowledge.
Paul's going to answer that one for us.
So it relates to the medical, but I believe 65 for the kind of cap at the moment, and then looking at being medically fit. So after a certain age, you start to have to take a medical more regularly to make sure you're still good to go to sea.
Thank you. Someone else is asking what the daily running cost for Chiswick Lifeboat Station is.
About £2,000 a day.
Right. And also someone else has asked, do you charge people when they've been negligent or really stupid to get themselves into trouble?
Not that I've been aware of. We might check.
I know the answer to that, but I'm
No, we often get donations afterwards, with letters of thanks and people grateful for having been given assistance and wanting to share their gratitude. But I don't think there's a formal charge.
No, there's no charge. In fact, quite often, because we're here all the time, right? And quite often you'll just get this knock on the door one day, and it's someone at the door, and they'll begin to recount one of 2 types of stories to you. They'll either say, you rescued me or this person or that person or my brother, sister or something, and I wanted to drop a check in, or how could I make a donation, and just thank you for doing that. And that happens often. And then every now and again, you'll get that same knock on the door, and but the person standing there that time is saying, it's been a while, but I wanted to come in and thank you for saving my life. And when you talk about, the reward, do we charge? I tell you what, when you get those knocks on the door and the person who you saved 6 months ago, 6 years ago, whatever it is, when they come back to thank you, it's incredible. And it's why we do this. And certainly, we talk about, and we put the link in the thing for the Comedy Club fundraising event, and we are a charity and we fundraise for everything we do. We get to see what, and we try to tell the stories through the videos and stories like this, and when we do Saving Lives at Sea and those sort of things as well. But it's an incredible feeling when someone says thank you for saving my life. It's indescribable, and we get to be at the front end of that. We get to see the actual rescue happen. But Libby, so many people know there's so many people behind the scenes, particularly the fundraisers and the people that donate, that help make all that happen.
The last fundraising event that I was at, along with Chiswick Lifeboat Station, was the Reindeer Run. and we had 2 of the crew who did the reindeer run, running in their full crew kit with reindeer antlers on the top of their helmets. It was a very fine sight. So next one, right, there's a few about narrowboats here. What are the typical, oops, it's disappeared. Sorry, it's moved on the screen. What are the typical issues that narrowboaters get into on the Thames?
Narrowboats are quite underpowered for their size, so when they end up on the Thames, they get beaten by the wind and also the tide itself. So the tide is a major factor for them. If there's a crosswind as well, they can't steer into it as well. So it makes life very awkward for them.
But are you saying you've had to actually rescue people because of that?
Oh yeah, loads. Yeah, the tide is very strong on the Thames, and if you get the wind as well, it makes life very difficult for narrowboats. So we've rescued quite a few.
Right. Somebody also who's been on the Thames on their boat. My experience of using VHF on the upper reaches of the tidal Thames is that it's very patchy. Is there a case for advising boats to use a mobile in emergencies rather than channel 16?
Yeah, by all means. Yeah. So 16 is monitored. It's monitored by us and the Coast Guard. Bearing in mind, we might be monitoring it, but we might be listening to a lot of other stuff too. The port traffic control on the Thames is VHF 14, which is monitored by a lot more other people. And certainly if you're passaging through London, it would be 14 that you'd want to be monitoring. Aside from all of those, if things were going horribly wrong, just ring, and this is anywhere in the tidal section, just ring 999 and ask for the Coast Guard.
Thank you. Simon's asking, what are the sort of incidents where people wait too long to ask for help?
Generally, anything relating to the tide. So, you know, if somebody's injured on the foreshore and the tide's coming in, it can catch people out quite quickly on the Thames. Like Glenn said, it moves in quite a rate of knots. So if they're injured on the foreshore, or anything where the situation has got more difficult to operate in. So if you've gone from day to night, or situations like that make it slightly more drawn out to affect a rescue. So they're kind of the key examples.
I think the thing that we would always say is don't wait until it's too late. If things are starting to go wrong, ask for help early, because we're here anyway, and 9 times out of 10, we want a reason to go out. So, you know, we'll go out, we'll have a look. Even if you've got it sorted and you're making your own way, we'll keep an eye out to make sure everything's fine. But just don't wait until it's properly going wrong before you make that call for help.
Yeah, I think people are inclined to try and solve their problems and then realize before they realize they've made them worse.
Yep.
Somebody's asked, what medical training do the London crew need?
Well, we just refreshed on that. So the standard medical training for all crew is a 3-day casualty care course, which we do every 3 years, plus an formal annual requalification of the CPR techniques that we need to know, and as well as a lot of ad hoc scenarios and practices that we run within the crews whilst we're on station. That's the simple summary.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, do you know why the boat that was at risk running down the young rowers didn't drop an anchor or two?
I suspect they might have been a little bit rapid in headlights and forgot to do it.
Right. Another question about and this is to do with, do you work with the PLA to educate tideway users, e.g. in the power of the flows, wind, weather, etc.?
Yeah, we do a lot of work with the PLA, yeah. Mhm.
I have a question here that says, what are the speeds of the Thames? I presume that means that, is that the speeds of the river or the speeds of the boats? I'm not sure. Ian, if you want to clarify that question, please do.
We have limits on the Thames, 8 knots and 12 knots for general private boats. Some commercial and clipper boats have extra exemptions allow them to go faster, but then they have to sit exams to allow them to do that.
Right, his answer to my question was both, so he was wondering about the speed of the river as well. Speed of the.
So it depends whether or not we've got a lot of water coming off the fields with a fluvial flow. But somewhere between 2 and 4 knots is depending if it's a spring or a neap tide, is where we're kind of sitting at roughly. And then sometimes when it's particularly dry, we'll get weaker ebb tides, and sometimes we'll get stronger floods. Really depends on the amount of surface water that's fallen within the last week or so. But somewhere between 2 and 4 knots.
And that is very location dependent. And as Paul said, it can fluctuate wildly if there's a lot of rainwater coming down. So we have recorded 12 knots at Teddington Lock and Weir. So it again, remember what I said in the presentation, check the weather and tide and see what's going on. And for anyone who's coming down through Teddington Lock and Weir, is if it's red boards in the non-tidal, it's going to be red boards in the tidal as well.
Yeah. Totally different question. My son is a volunteer with the Ride Inshore Lifeboat, which is not RNLI. I understand there are others dotted around the coast. Is there a particular reason they could not be absorbed into RNLI?
Some of them are historic. So where I live up in Norfolk, there's one called Case Lifeboat. It used to be run by the RNLI until 1969. And our boats got faster and it was less viable to have a boat off the beach. So we could cover the same area with a faster boat with fewer stations. But some of the communities wanted to keep the lifeboat service in their own village. So they set up private ones.
And Paul, you've got some experience with independence as well. And just because the name on the side of the boat might not be RNLI, it's quite normal for us, where we can, to help a lot of those operators either with training or governance or prevention activity or all sorts of things, isn't it? You'll notice a lot of the kit, certainly the PPE and the life jackets and dry suits and helmets and what have you, that cruise on independent lifeboats use, is strikingly similar to the PPE that RNLI lifeboat crews use as well. And we've done all the research and development on it, and then they've been able to benefit and piggyback off of that.
Right. Somebody said your crew tonight don't look very happy. How did they cheer themselves up during cold winter nights?
That's not true.
We're always happy, Libby.
I don't think they're going to get an answer. You're going to get an answer to that, Matt.
But it's a really interesting point because, you know, what is it, 95%, and certainly something like 85% of our people here are volunteer, and our crews are volunteer. And if they didn't want to do this, and if they didn't enjoy doing it, they wouldn't be here. It's really, so, you know, it is fun. It's great. And that's why, you know, that's why we've got so much interest in people wanting to do it. So if they weren't smiling and if they weren't happy, I don't think they'd be
We're happy on the inside.
Well, one of the things that's striking about having the system you've got at Chiswick and at Tower and Gravesend is that all sorts of people that couldn't volunteer if they had to have a pager because of the nature of their work or whatever, are able to volunteer for your stations, aren't they?
Yeah, very much.
Right, Simon. Now, Simon, I know Simon well. He's a great one for gadgets. In fact, he competes with gadgets, so I'm not surprised that he's asked the question. You've rightly got lots of gadgets on board. What new gadget would you like to add to the collection?
Oh,
new gadget.
each one. Yeah, so who would, well, everyone's going to answer this one. So, Tim, you get to go first.
Oh. Okay. Oh. Can I go last? No, I don't know. I don't know. I've got stage fright.
Having served in the armed services, dual vision army night vision goggles.
Yeah, not gun.
You just got a single moniker, a single one. To be quite fun to have two.
What?
Like we were saying, a kettle would be nice, but a drone. There's quite a lot of technology going on with eyes in the sky. So the fire service has got a drone we work with sometimes, so that might be quite interesting to explore.
A parabolic dish microphone that rigs into our comm system is directional.
Super spy.
There you are, Simon. Now you know what you can donate to Chiswick Lifeboat Station. Simon's also asking, do you crew with the same people each shift, or do you get mixed around?
It's pretty much mixed around. Yeah.
During COVID, you had specific groups.
During COVID was the exception to that. So in lockdown 1, because none of us really knew what we were dealing with, did we? So in lockdown 1, we split the whole crew up into dedicated teams, and they would come in, and we split it up into 9 teams, and that team of 9 would make up a crew of 3 to come in and do a 24-hour shift. And then after their 24 hours was done, they'd go home for 6 days. And then 7 days later, they'd come back in. And we distance, segregated, separated all of those teams and delivered it continuously like that for about 10 weeks. We did that. The idea behind it is that should anyone on one team go positive or become unavailable, we would then stand the whole team down and then bring in a relief team that we had waiting in the wings. But it worked. And in fact, some people, some of them wish we'd go back to doing 24-hour shifts. They really enjoyed it. There's a lot of reasons for us to not do it. And in fact, the only thing that really made it work was the fact that the whole country was in total lockdown. And because our crews, both staff and volunteers, are considered key workers, so we all had travel exemption letters that allowed us to go out and come here. So in lockdown 1, and to some degree in lockdown 2, coming to the lifeboat station to do your shifts was pretty much the only thing that got you out of the house.
Right, we're coming to the end of the questions. I think I can answer Mary's one myself, because it says, how and where can we get our life jackets checked? Would you do this at IWA Canalway Cavalcade? Well, we are inviting RNLI to come to Cavalcade as we've done in the past. And it's something I shall be talking to Wayne about. And yes, in the past we've had this, for those that don't know, this is an event at Little Venice at the beginning of May, which God willing will go ahead this year, unlike the last 2 years. And before that, we did have RNLI there, and they were doing the life jacket checks, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, we can definitely arrange that, Libby, to do the life jacket clinics over 2 or 3 days that weekend if you want. Sure.
Yep, 30th of April to the 2nd of May. I think the only other question I've missed, well, not missed, but is about, or just not raised yet, is what was who was responsible for life saving on the Thames before the RNLI?
That's one of those questions that I'm probably going to want to answer. So, who was responsible? So the reason, so I'm going to try to answer this, but in a politically correct and backwards fashion, I think. The Marsh Nest disaster happened in 1989 and ultimately led to a public inquiry. And it took a change in government, and many years had to pass before that inquiry came to fruition, and that was testimony to the families of the people who died that night, and their tenacity to make that happen. And that effort that they put in wasn't in vain, and the public inquiry led to a number of recommendations. There were well over 140 of them, but there were two really interesting ones within the 140. And most of the recommendations would be things that you'd expect to see in a public inquiry, but there were two that were quite different. And the first asked for a risk assessment to be done. So you think of in this day and age, we use the term risk assessment, and everyone's pretty fed up of hearing about it, really. But back in 1998, that wasn't the case, and people assessing things based on risk, it was a different time. It's normal now, and it wasn't then. And the risk assessment looked at research. The Institute of Naval Medicine did a study into cold water survivability and what rescue times should need to be for people who were in the water. And the first set of recommendations largely focused on what the dedicated rescue provision needs to look like. And then the second piece of work that happened around that, another one of the recommendations, was, okay, we've got all this resource, all the boats and all the equipment now on the river, but how do we coordinate it so that system and that team of people work effectively and efficiently? So the way those two recommendations morphed into reality was firstly the lifeboats that the RNLI provide, and then the second one was the creation of London Coast Guard. And London Coast Guard is very unique in the Coast Guard world in terms of how it operates and how it's manned and what its mandate is and what its responsibilities are. But essentially, London Coast Guard now coordinates, irrespective of whose boat it might be. It certainly will be one of ours because we are dedicated for search and rescue, but there's a lot of other organizations who are declared assets for search and rescue, with it the police or the fire brigade or the Port of London Authority or Port Health. So these are boats that can help out if a search or if some sort of operation is running, in addition to the dedicated response that the RNLI provides. So your question was, who did it before us? It was a collection of the people who are still here today with the Port Authority, the police, the fire service, and they were doing the best they could, but the addition of the RNLI's lifeboat service and then the creation of London Coast Guard brought two elements to that package that hadn't existed before. So I'm sorry, there's a bit of a long-winded answer. I hope that answers it. But obviously, I'm not trying to sit here and say someone wasn't doing their job, because that's not what was happening. They were doing the best they could, as any of us obviously would. But it needed a bigger piece of strategic work done over the top of it to actually realize it could be a whole lot better. And 20 years on, we've done, I think it's about 18 or 19,000 incidents now. saved around about the lives of about 200 people. You know, it's busy, and these are now the busiest lifeboat stations within the RNLI's entire network of 238, and London Coast Guard is the busiest operations room in the entire Coast Guard network across the UK, and it's manned by one person.
I think you've given an excellent answer, Wayne, and I think perhaps one of the things to add to that is that there was one of the things that was recognised, there was no dedicated search and rescue. The others all had responsibilities for other things, and the RNLI came in absolutely dedicated to search and rescue.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of one of the key differences. So it wasn't, as Wayne says, it wasn't that people were doing a bad job so much as it was recognized that somebody needed to be totally focused on search and on rescue. And that's what the RNLI is there to do, and does incredibly well. And I'm very proud to be one of its fundraisers. I'd just like to, at this point, say it's great to see the crew, some of which I know. I would like to thank Wayne enormously and his crew for giving up their time this evening to share so much information with us. And I'm hoping that we shall be able to generate within the IWA a donation or two, and good luck with the rest of your work. And I'd just like to thank everybody for coming tonight. I knew it would be a really excellent talk, and you've done us proud. So thank you again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening, Wayne, and crew. I hope you're not called out on too many things on this cold night out into that cold river. And see some of you next month, and I will see the lifeboat crew very soon, I hope.
Thank you,
Good night,
Libby.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.